Alors, sans plus tarder, je vais vous présenter Nuria Rodrigues-Ortega. Je suis vraiment ravie de l'accueillir ici aujourd'hui, vraiment très honorée. Elle est professeure d'histoire de l'art à l'Université de Malaga et elle dirige aussi, entre autres, son département d'histoire de l'art. Elle dirige énormément d'institutions. Je ne vais pas vous faire la liste, mais je suis très impressionnée. Elle dirige aussi le IART East Lab, un laboratoire de recherche, de formation et d'innovation consacré à l'étude de la culture artistique sous ses perspectives numériques, computationnelles et technocritiques. Ces recherches portent sur la convergence entre les langages computationnels, les médias numériques et la culture artistique, avec un accent particulier sur l'application de l'analyse des données à l'étude des systèmes culturels complexes. Les traitements automatiques du langage naturel pour l'analyse des textes artistiques, la configuration de nouvelles épistémologies visuelles et formelles dans le domaine de la vision par ordinateur, ainsi que l'exploration des récits alternatifs liés aux technologies de réalité mixte. Elle étudie également la manière dont l'intelligence artificielle reformule le processus de catégorisation et d'organisation des objets culturels. C'est très intéressant pour nous à ce séminaire. Elle a également publié et mené des recherches sur la muséologie critique et post-critique dans le contexte de la culture numérique. D'autres axes de recherche sont les protocoles, méthodologies et procédures pour la gestion et le développement des projets numériques dans les domaines culturels et la muséologie critique dans le contexte de la culture numérique. Ici vient toute une liste de ces présidences honoraires ou pas honoraires, mais je tiens à rappeler que depuis 2016, elle est directrice scientifique de l'école d'été Digital Art History, Data Driven Analysis and Digital Narratives. Je pense que tu avais été un de ses invités il y a quelques années, n'est-ce pas? Et cette école d'été est une initiative conjointe de l'Université de Malaga, de l'Université de Berkeley et de l'Université Ludwig-Maximilian de Munich. The floor is yours. And thank you so much for being here. On aura 3 interventions aujourd'hui, donc elle parlera une quarantaine de minutes. On l'interrogera, on lui posera des questions et puis on verra. Si on sera très fatigué, on fera la pause, mais j'espère que non. Et on donnera tout de suite la parole ensuite à Leonardo, qu'on fera la pause après. Si vous tenez bon.
Wow. So thank you. I'm so sorry. I have to speak in English because my French is not useful for this lecture. Okay. So thank you. Oh, sorry. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here, to have the opportunity to share with you my idea about the AI generative technologies. Okay, my presentation today revolves around this notion of pansemiotics, and I will try to explore what kind of new pansemiotic processes and what new semiotic objects are involved in this emerging pansemiotic era. But firstly, I'd like to say that my argumentation today is based on 2 premises that I discussed in this paper a couple of years ago. The first premise is that we are witnessing a process of vectorization of culture, or the formation of a vectoral culture, as consequence of the eclosion of AI technologies, which, as we know, can only process vectors of numerical characteristics, and thus this process is intrinsically different from the digitization process that defined the so-called digital culture. And then we can say that we are in a completely new scenario. Now, through the presentation, I will elaborate more about this idea, and I will explain why I think that we are in a completely new scenario, and this notion of the pansemiotic era has to do with that. And the second premise is that within the framework of this vectorized culture, the vector emerges as the new cultural sign of the AI era, to the extent that, as we can see more or less in this slide, A vector represents a cultural object through a set of numerical values that relate to it, to the cultural object, in terms of mathematical abstractions. And in some way, we could say that the vector is a mathematical representation of a cultural object, or that represents a cultural object in a form of mathematical abstraction. And consequently, the vectoral space or latent space constituted by vectors distributed in distances mathematically computed emerges as a new system of science articulated through a grammar of mathematical relations. In this context, the concept of vectorial semiotics or vector semiotics could be proposed. Regarding this vectorial semiotic, we have to keep in mind a specific consideration. Just to mention some of them, for example, we have to think to take into account that these signs, these vectors, are not constrained by the materiality of any particular medium because they exist as abstract numerical representations in the AI system. So we could say that the numerical form constitutes a medium, which is another way to see or to interpret this scenario. Or, for example, that they are not addressed to human subjects, but to algorithms. And this calls for an inevitable post-anthropocentric theoretical framework and for the elaboration of a post-humanistic hermeneutics. I will come back to this issue in the last part of my presentation. But according to the purposes of today, what I would like to highlight is that one of the pivotal consequences of this process of cultural vectorization is what we could call the ontological flattening of traditional semiotic systems, because as we know from a computational perspective, there is no substantive, material, or ontological distinction between words, images, sounds, and other forms of cultural productions. They all share the same nature and mode of existence. They are vectors. And this circumstance has particular implications in the context of AI multimodal models where vectors representing different semiotic objects coexist. Indeed, and this is the main thesis of this presentation, it could be argued that multimodality, traditionally defined as the existence and interaction of different semiotic systems, vanishes in latent spaces and is replaced by a continuity of vectors. And it is in this light that it might be proposed that multimodal latent spaces become a form of pansemiotic systems where linguistic and visual systems are subsumed into a unified vectorial continuity devoid of middle references. And I think that this scenario compels us, first of all, to reconsider from a new angle the concept of word and image as distinct semiotic objects, but particularly compel us to re-examine the modes of interaction and convergence, what we have traditionally understood as intersemiotic processes, and to explore how these intersemiotic processes are transforming this new pansemiotic landscape. And of course, a further imperative is to investigate how meaning production is reconfigured in this pansemiotic landscape. So to address this question, my approach consists of delineating more than 4 concepts, I will say, 4 interconnected areas of problematization, each organized around a dialectical pair of concepts that confronts classical intersemiotic notions with the concept emerging from the vectorial logic. And in certain cases, I will propose new concepts that I believe can be useful for thinking and interpreting this field. My intention is also to contribute to the systematization of a conceptual framework, a set of concepts, analytical categories, and especially a renewed terminology, because I think that the use of the proper term is critical, because the use of the proper term can properly direct our questions, our inquiries. So I think that this is also an important thing to take into account. Okay, so the first area of problematization puts into play the concept of mediality and intermediality and intervectoriality and intersemanticity that are the concepts that are proposed. The thing is that this ontological equalization, which is at the base of the pansemiotic shift, shifts the focus from the classic problem of intersemioticity understood as a problem of intermediality, the analysis of medial differences and the exploration of how distinct media interact and translate their semiotic features, to the problem of intervectoriality, which is a notion, a concept that foregrounds the relationships among vectors themselves rather than the media. And I think that this is a good term. I think that this term functions pretty well, because as we know, in a latent space, a vector's identity is determined not by its mediality, which strictly speaking no longer exists, or at least not in the traditional sense, but by its position. I mean, its dynamic distance to and statistical correlations with other vectors. And this concept, which is an intervectoriality, also encodes the very semantics of latent spaces, defining what each vector means in relation to all others. Therefore, intervectoriality also foregrounds this idea that vectors are never or shouldn't be considered discrete entities, but nodes in a continuously structured semantic manifold. Consequently, in the vectorial semiotic, particularly in the pansemiotic system, the intersemiotic problem is no longer about relation between discrete media, this is obvious, but rather the relationships between abstract and mathematical representations of meaning that traverse or extend across a semantic continuity that embeds both visual and linguistic characteristics in numerical form. Building on this, I propose this concept, the concept of intersemanticity that I defined at first instance, and I say at first instance because I will complete the definition later on, as a capacity of pansemiotic system to navigate and merge linguistic and visual meaning seamlessly within a single numerical field, just exploring neighborhoods of meaning instead of bridging media gaps or interconnecting media differences. And just to put an example, we can take this image generated with a prompt at the echo of silent voices. When processed by a generative model, the words voices and silence activate regions of the latent space where clusters corresponding to concepts like cover mouth, misty atmosphere, desolation, mysticism, and oppression are densely packed. So we get an image composed by elements that visually materialize these different semantic dimensions associated to the word, to the linguistic expression silent voices. Because these clusters occupy nearby regions of this shared manifold, the model can fusion them without explicit intermediate translation. I mean, we don't need to explicitly mention words as isolated photos or copy atmosphere, etc. So this process, which is the operational logic of a pansemiotic system, is what I call intersemanticity, because a pansemiotic system doesn't require any mediating act of translation. Instead, it simply samples and refines the highest probability points, and I will come back to this issue in a moment, in a shared semantic landscape that embeds both visual and linguistic meaning. So, as I said before, the intersemiotic problem is no longer about relating distinct media, but about navigating relationships among abstract representations of meaning that expand a continuous semantic field. And of course, this carries significant conceptual implications. For example, if semantic relations emerge from intervectorial proximities rather than from medium-specific features, it then suggests that meaning can be or could be understood independently of medial features, independently of the material form that conveys them, thereby opening the possibility of meaning beyond media. And from my point of view, this raises a fascinating, interesting line of inquiry into whether these medial features could be really obliterated or not, especially if we take into account that these medial features, these medial determinations are or remain inextricable from human experiences. Our interaction with meanings is always mediated through the material embodiment of a sign, whether a word or an image, even as we know a conceptual art has not been able to entirely forgo its manifestation within a medial object, a material artifact. And after all, we don't relate directly with vectors, but with this kind of material embodiment. I will return to this point at the end of my presentation because it is a important issue to discuss what kind of neo-semiotic entities these generative processes are generating. And this is the last issue that I would like to address today. Okay, so meaning this is the issue, meaning beyond media. This is the question that by now I will leave in the air. But intersemanticity, as I understand this concept, isn't just a feature of latent spaces or of the generative logic of AI. It also becomes a quality of the resulting image, of the resulting output in itself. And then it could be considered a category of analysis of these neo-semiotic objects. In this case, in the echo or the silent voices, the final embedding arises from the probabilistic overlay of several semantic clusters close together in the latent space. Or at least we could distinguish this form, more or less. During the diffusion process, the model probabilistically draws features from its cluster in proportion to their latent probabilities. So there is no singular cluster chosen. Instead, the final image is an amalgam of the most representative features of all 4 clusters. Therefore, the result is an intrinsically intersemantic artifact, a simultaneous evocation of cloistered silence, pagan ritual, icy desolation, and ethereal reverie, all co-present on a single visual plane. But intersemanticity refers not only to the merging of semantic clusters, but also to the fusion of visual and linguistic meanings in a unified sign. Within these intersemantic artifacts, linguistic meanings are materially inscribed in visual form. For example, we could mention these 2 examples that I think that are very, very obvious. The thing is that each element is the visual imprint of a linguistic subvector in the latent space, because the model never translates text into image that directly projects a visual concept of past-silent voices encoded in the prompt's linguistic vector. This is for me intersemanticity as well as a quality of this new sign, I mean the fusion of linguistic and visual meanings in a unified sign. Nevertheless, I will retake this issue of the fusion of linguistic and visual meaning in the final part of the presentation, because it is also an interesting point to discuss the new semiotic object that these generative processes are producing, as I said before, is the last issue that I would like to address today. By now, I will say that this scenario involves, of course, research implication, because as I said before, this vectorial approach shifts the focus from analyzing media gaps or media differences to mapping the neighborhoods where meanings convert and diffuse, because in latent spaces what matters is how clusters of vectors convert, diverge, or network one another in that space. So this transforms the intersemiotic studies in a form of semantic topology whose primary object is semantic continuity. So now we have questions such as how do semantic clusters group together, or what trajectory do from follow across the manifold, or which regions of the latent space remain uncharted or silence, etc. And regarding the analysis of images, we replace questions such as what is transformed when translating from language to image, which is a traditional question in intersemiotic studies, with questions such as which vector neighborhoods yield this image, or why certain cluster combinations are most probable and how they produce this kind of intersemantic artifacts. But not everything is semantic or exclusively semantic, I have to say that, because one of the issues is to see the convergence or the interaction between intermediality and intersemanticity. And we have to take into account that this image also reverberates collective construction of visual and linguistic meanings encoded within the model. Therefore, the image generated in response to the linguistic vector silent voices doesn't establish direct relationship with the words as they appear in the dictionary, but invokes a culturally constructed visual concept embedded in that word. And it is in this sense that we can say that, or that we say that generated images operate as a sort of instantiation of a collective statistical memory. Consequently, although it may seem paradoxical, it is precisely this abstract representation of semantic continuity and in the mathematical abstraction of semiotic features or media features that opens a path for the exploration of a new scale and depth of how meanings and complex concepts have been intermediately constructed and transformed over time. For example, in this image that we can consider materialization of the different visual manifestation of the different concepts associated to the linguistic expression silent voices. And now we have this material to explore this different visual manifestation and different semantic dimensions associated to this linguistic expression. Okay. The second area of problematization revolves around the concept of the difference and the similarity, and around the concept of dialectical tension and probabilistic tension and statistical ambiguity. And this area is also interesting to me because in traditional semiotics, although the boundaries between semiotic systems and media are understood to be fluid and blurred, they remain distinct. Indeed, we could say that semiotic systems signify because of their medial and ontological differences, and that meaning emerges in an interaction and negotiation, whether by convergence, conflict, or contradiction. Let me consider Anne Carson's work next. For me, Knox is a fascinating intersemiotic object that takes the form of a literary book in which Carson interleaves her English translations of Catalogs 101 with photos, fun postcards, family letters, and her own pencil sketches. The work functioned as a kind of elegiac response to the death of her brother, Michael. But in this work, the meaning of absence and mourning, which are the main topics of this poem, emerges in the immediate discontinuity. I mean, the abrupt shift from poetic language to fragments of smudged text, from nervous handwriting to yellow photographs. So it is the dialectical interplay between these fragments, these different media fragments, that evokes loss, meaning that no single medium could convey the weight of memory alone. But algorithmic vectorization radically transformed the landscape. First of all, because as we have seen, the vectorization of linguistic and visual science result in a regime of sameness, both conceptually and formally, because we have vectors and their semantic and numerical characteristics in all cases. What emerges then is a semantic continuity where vectors are more or less similar to one another, depending on their spatial contiguity mathematically computed. So in this context, I think that this is a very important issue. The concept of semiotic distance understood as the irreducible difference that exists between different media objects, between different semiotic objects. This is to signal qualitative distinction and becomes degrees of similarity. And this for me is not trivial. It is fundamental to understand how this meaning produced in this new pansemiotic scenario. And secondly, because it's important not to forget that AI operates fundamentally within a regime of similarity. AI algorithms are trained to detect patterns, essentially commonalities, and establish statistical correlations that create relationships of similarity between vectors. And at this point, I think it's important to recall that the primary goal of multimodal models is to align linguistic and visual vectors based on criteria of coherence and correspondence. So the ultimate objective is statistical optimization, understood as maximizing coherence, or basically achieving the most accurate correspondence between text and image. And I think that this scenario leads us to re-problematize the concept of difference within the context of this pansemiotic system, and especially lead us to explore how the reformulation of the concept of difference affects the production of meaning, the meaning of production. We could mention many concepts involved in this problematization, but I would like to put the attention in my subsequent area of discussion, as I said before, articulated around the notions of coherence and alignment as main operational principles in AI generative processes, and the notion of dialectical tension as one of the main mechanisms of meaning production in traditional intersemiotic processes or phenomena. Because in traditional intersemiotic processes, there is always an inherent dialectical tension, just as a consequence of that irreducible space of difference, irreducible distance that always exists when different semiotic objects come into play. And this inherent dialectical tension also has to do with the limits of this relationship, or in other words, with the impossibility of fully suture this distance, this gap, which is a classical problem in intersemiotic studies. I mean, the limits of translating, for example, from one media to another. Coming back to Ankarson's work, Knox. Knox constitutes a contemporary instantiation of that irreducible distance between different semiotic objects, between different media, between word and image. With just a few lines, her translations and fragments of letters, Carson evokes the pain of loss, nostalgia, and longing. But those words, evocative as they may be, can only serve as suggestions of the image of a faded picture of her brother's friend, the torn edges of an old childhood photograph, or the ink-smudged strokes in a paper. Because the photographs and physical ephemera carry a material specificity, the grain of paper, the blur of a picture, the texture of those traces left on paper by the gesture of writing. As we can see, I don't know if we can see this very well, but it's in the last image, you can see these textures of writing that resist any verbal description. I mean, they cannot be captured by language. So when Carson reproduces the handwriting who were you? Bearing in mind her brother, her text of course evokes nostalgia. But the original strokes tremor, the emphasis in the writing lies beyond transcription. I mean, they cannot be transcribed. So the poem discusses her images and physical objects, photographs, letters to complete the mourning experience, and we perceive meaning in the space where language cannot fully interpret the image and the image cannot fully embody the word. But AI models aim precisely to minimize this gap by resolving tensions through statistical prediction and ensuring a direct correspondence and accurate alignment between linguistic and visual vectors, both representing the similar content or concept in the vector structure. So this kind of semiotic tension that we see, and especially that we experiment in this work, is not available in latent spaces because the algorithm doesn't leave room for contradiction, for conflict, for paradox, or semantic drift. It aims to resolve rather than sustain difference. And there is no tension in this word image relationship, among other things, because in generative models, language apparently only functions as an instruction to guide the process. So this not only redefines the word image relationship in purely functional terms, but also suggests a tension, dialectical tension as a mechanism of meaning production is effectively eliminated within the vectoral system, and that is replaced by statistical correlation materializing the concept of coherence and correspondence. But the interesting point here is that the concept of tension is not completely removed, but rather reframed within the vector system. It simply relocates it to a new domain, and this domain is the domain of statistical ambiguity, which is a concept of now we have to deal with. Given the probabilistic nature of the generative process, we know that multiple images may correspond with the concept of silent voices, with varying degrees of accuracy or fidelity, or even materializing different concepts that you can see in these images generated with the same prompt, and that materialize different concepts associated to this idea of the silent voices. We get this kind of ghosty images where silent voices seem to correspond with deaf voices, spiritual voices, or whatever. I mean, the important thing is different concepts associated with this linguistic expression. So we know that this image is not the only way to materialize the concept embedded in the linguistic expression silent voices, but yet a sample with the highest probability among a wide range of options and alternatives. Therefore, tension now manifests as a range of probabilities in the statistical correlations. And this transforms the traditional intersemiotic tension based on distance difference between systems ontologically and medially differentiated into a probabilistic tension, where the issue becomes one of varying degrees of precise correspondence or alignment. So now tension is this, varying degrees of precise correspondence or alignment. Indeed, the interpretive ambiguity we observe in this image, where, as we saw before, multiple readings coexist because of overlapping cluster or score highly for silent voices, can be considered as a visual translation of a probabilistic tension. So probabilistic tension is not only, this is not only a operational principle of AI generative models, but also can be considered a quality of the resulting output and then a potential category of analysis. In this case, probabilistic tension arises when multiple clusters have nearly equal probability. So the model hesitates, and what the model does is to blend features in balanced proportions. So the resulting image exhibits elements from each cluster, for example, monastic drapery, folkloric veils, winter fog, etc., reflecting the algorithm's internal competition. So as we can guess, these overlapping of forms and atmospheres is not an instead diffusion or the product of an expressive intent, of course, but the direct translation into imagery of the statistical competition between options of almost equal probability. It is not a stylistic decision, obviously, but a symptom of converging probabilities. Each visual picture signals the experiment with its cluster influence the generation, and the coexistence in a single composition is precisely the visual expression of that probabilistic tension. So in this kind of generated images, the classic intermediate space between systems or media no longer exists between media, but within the algorithm itself as a field of competing vector. So the question shifts again, because from, for example, what is again transformed or what is lost when we move from text to image, which is a classical question in intersemiotic studies, now we ask which statistical tendencies coexist in this single output and how do they shape our reading. And I think that our task as viewers and as critics is to navigate that ambiguity, recognizing that each interpretation and non-which spirit of the beyond is a projection, and I will come back to this concept in a moment, within the statistical range defined by the prompt. Each viewer will anchor on the cluster fragment that resonates most with their own cultural background. And that choice becomes part of a new dialogue that AI sets up between text, images, statistics, and human interpretation. In some way, we could say that human interpretation now becomes an act of anchoring within a probabilistic field. Okay, the third area of problematization puts into play the concept of the possible and the predictive, and subsequently the concept of the representation and probabilistic projection. For me, again, this area is interesting because the probabilistic nature of AI models implies that algorithmic processes within vector systems operate under a regime of the predictor, establishing, in my view, a clear distinction from the possibilistic regime that characterizes traditional intersemiotic phenomena. To qualify my position, I have to say that I understand a possibilistic regime and the concept of the possible in line with the Lewisian concept of the virtual and the becoming. So for me, a possibilistic regime refers to a context in which creative processes are open to indeterminacy and are not governed by the rules of what is predictable or what can be represented. In this regime, the truly new emerges not as a variation within a set of pre-existing possibilities, but as something entirely distinct and singular emerging from processes of differentiation. And from my perspective, traditional intersemiotic processes embodies this openness because when different semiotic systems converge, it retains its irreducible otherness, serving as cultural mediations with the objective of affecting or transforming meaning by producing a new one, which is open to indeterminacy. And Ankarsos Knox again exemplify this. In one section, Carson includes a photograph of her brother, accompanied not by a description, but by poetic and etymological reflections. So the photograph remains opaque because language doesn't explain it, but rather cycles around its emotional atmosphere, its emotional absence. So this interplay creates a space of indeterminacy where neither the visual nor the verbal fully resolves into meaning, and the reader is left navigating the affective and interpretive gaps between them. But in any generative models operate by selecting the most statistically coherent and correct output for a given prompt. And this probabilistic predictive regime collapses indeterminacy. For example, if we think on latent spaces and a space of possibilities, we could say that the generative processes operate by constraining that space of possibilities into a reduced set of probabilities governed by a coherence and correspondence principle. In this point, we could say that, okay, this issue of reducing meanings is also an inherent part of traditional intersemiotic processes. For example, in emphasis, when it encapsulates an image or a cultural object in language, and we say, okay, this is a way to reducing the different meanings of interpretation that this cultural object can convey, because we are selecting one and we are fixing this interpretation of this meaning in a specific linguistic expression. And we could put as an example this very famous phrases by Rilke, where he proposes a very focused reading that collapses the sculpture's inherent polysemy into a singular moral vision, and then by describing the object with words as suffused with brilliance from inside, like a lamp, and attributing to it a gaze that gleams in all its power, usually is transforming the cold marble of the statue in a living vessel of inner energy. So what Rilke is doing is brackets off alternative interpretations in favor of an ethical imperative, as we can see in the final part of the poem, where we say, you must change your life. Okay, in trend, we also argue that algorithmic processes are not entirely closed, since the probabilistic tension and statistical ambiguity mentioned earlier allows for different images to be generated from a single input, and even these images can have different interpretations and different grades. That's good. But in traditional intersemiotic phenomena, for example, ekphrasis, the openness to new, to indeterminate possibilities of meaning is not the result of a process of multiplying meanings. Instead, it is an effect of the inherent dialectical tension between different semiotic objects, between different media, between language and image. It is precisely the limit of language to fully encapsulating the nuances of the image and vice versa, thereby leaving a space for the unsaid, the implicit, or the absent that allow for a margin of indeterminacy, as we can see in Ancarso's work, where meaning emerges through the tension produced by the limits of every semiotic object to fully explain each other. But this is something that we can also see in this ekphrasis by Rilke. Even the lamp metaphor, although this is a very vivid metaphor, remains deliberately indeterminate. Does it evoke a flickering flame, steady glow, or a latent fire? So this semantic otherness, which is or openness, which is inherent of language, floating between spirituality, vital force, etc., proposes many resonances with ever relinquishing Rilke's singular moral charge. Furthermore, the probabilistic tension, that is the operational principle of AI generative models, is precisely the reason why these possibilities, these different generated images cannot be considered a framework of possibilities. Sorry. Sorry. Okay, a framework of possibilities open to indeterminacy regarding the linguistic expression, the echo, the silent voices, because they are not indeterminate possibilities, but probable alternatives. Statistically ranked outcomes, which is a completely different thing. In fact, there is an intrinsic conflicting relationship between determinacy and probability, because the very purpose of probability is precisely to change determinacy through prediction. And again, we could mention and address many concepts associated or engaged with this or involved in this area of problematization. But I would like to focus the attention on the concept of representation, since it is one of the main concepts that we have to think about. Sorry, voice. Okay, traditionally, representation has been understood as a process of mediation between a sign, whether visual or linguistic, and its referent within a context where each element is distinct, and where the representational sign functions as a mediator between the referent, which is what is represented, and an observer. But in AI systems, there is no referent in a classical sense. What appears to be represented in AI-generated images, forests, women, ghostly figures, etc., doesn't refer to anything beyond inside. So it is the outcome of algorithmic processes that calculates the visual configuration most likely to align with a linguistic vector in a space of mathematical relations. We might argue that representation is not an intrinsic quality of non-generative images, of traditional images, or images of the artistic culture, and that's right. But even non-representational images still index something beyond themselves. For example, again, in Ancarso's notes, although she never decided exactly what a stain of ink, or the grain of a photograph, or a crumpled piece of paper like this evokes or represents or expresses, those marks still index reference. For example, moments lived, gestures written, the passage of time, etc. So these material traces bring into view histories and presences that one existed beyond the sign. But in generative imagery, by contrast, there is no trace of any event or object outside the sign itself, only the aggregate of millions of examples. So there is no indexical, there is only a statistical average. And in this way, we could say that, okay, what we are facing is a form of remaining representation, a sign that emerges internally within a system of numerical relation. It is a way to see this scenario. Or we might argue that what is generated in latent space is not a representation at all, but rather, as we saw before, a projection of probabilities within a mathematical relational space, which is a completely different phenomenon. I know that in the coming years, it will be necessary to debate whether we are witnessing a new form of understanding representation or an entirely different phenomenon that requires a new terminology and theoretical articulation. The latter position is my position. So in this context, I will propose the use of the term probabilistic projection instead of representation, because as I said at the beginning, the use of the proper terms is critical to properly direct our inquiries and our research questions. And I think that this term, probabilistic projection, better directs our inquiry than the representation, because we are facing different phenomena. Or put another way, what we're doing is moving from the concept of representation understood as a process of establishing correspondences between different signs, different entities, including the human subject, to the concept of predictive and statistical events. So now the production of semiotic objects is this, predictive statistical events, rather than a process of establishing correspondences between different signs, different entities. And this shift is very important because this affects the way in which we understand meaning. Because now meaning becomes what is most likely to emerge in latent space rather than the product of an interaction or negotiation between separate entities, as we have seen throughout the presentation. So what we see is therefore what is most likely according to the training corpus, according to the model's constraints, according to the user's prompt. So in this regime, we can say that meaning becomes probability, or that meaning is probability. And beyond this shift in mind, central questions arise. And maybe the most important central question is, what does it mean to see an A image? Because now it is not a matter of representation or expression, but of recognizing a pattern computed by probabilities. So the question we must pose now is not what does it represent, or even what does it mean, but which probabilities is it projecting and why, and what probability densities underlie the image. And from this point of view, classic semiotic concerns, classic semiotic questions, for example, the hegemony of specific icons or the legitimacy of certain discourses, must be reframed in terms of redistribution of probabilities. And that's why I said that we need to develop a sort of hermeneutics of probability, because only by reframing our research questions around prediction and probability and statistical correlations can we grapple with the ethical, political, and theoretical challenges of this post-representational and pansemiotic era. And if I have time, I will address the area of problematization, and that revolve around or put into play this concept of the post-human semiotics and the phenomenological divide, which is the concept that I propose, and I will explain what I mean by that. For me, it is fundamental to close my argumentation today about the pansemiotic era, bring into the discussion this issue, because by the moment the operations taking place in latent spaces are meaningful only to the extent that they have an impact in the space of human experience. As I said before, we don't relate directly with latent spaces, but with the outputs they produce. So it is essential to examine how the generative process is operating within latent space manifests in human experience. And as Catherine Hayes and other authors note, the generation of meaning in AI systems is not an internal process. Rather, it emerges through the interaction between humans and algorithms, between algorithmic processes and human interpretative practices. And that's why the semiotic becomes post-human semiotics, because we no longer negotiate meaning between ourselves and a cultural object, but between ourselves and the AI statistical probabilistic logic. So the question now, how does this relationship happen? And of course, this isn't a new issue in the field, and there is extensive literature about that. What I need to do in this final part of my presentation is just to contribute to the discussion by introducing what I'm calling the phenomenological divide, and I will explain what I mean by that. Okay, as I discussed, I come back with this image. And I discussed throughout my presentation, the distinction between word and image becomes irrelevant in latent spaces where a regime of sameness emerges. However, this idea needs to be reconsidered within the context of this post-human space or post-human semiotics or whatever, because the distinction between word and image remains fundamental to everyday human experience and to the ways in which we still encode knowledge. And as I said before, and I insist, we don't relate directly with vector, we relate with visual and linguistic science. But even on this semiotic surface, when we are not dealing with latent spaces, but with the final generative output that we see, read, or experiment, the traditional categories of word and image also need to be called into question. Why? And because although the sign produced at the end of the generative process is perceived by us as a visual sign, it can be considered an image in the traditional sense or a purely visual sign. From an ontogenetic perspective, it is a result of a transactive fusion of visual and linguistic features. And this is on my main thesis. This transactive process gives rise to a new type of semiotic entity. I don't have enough time to elaborate about the concept of transaction. As we know, it is a complex concept that can be approached or explained by different perspectives. But for the purposes of this presentation, we can use the very common definition of transaction that refers to the process of converting or transforming one form of energy or signal into another through a process of internal transformation that happens as consequence of the integration of features coming from an external source. And it is the integration of external features that drive this transformation that finally results in a new sign, as we can see, for example, in final transaction, in biochemistry, and all the transformations that take place inside the cell. Given how the generative logic behaves, it seems for me reasonable to propose that sign generation in Layton spaces operates as a process of transactive fusion. When I enter the prompt, the echo silent voices, that is encoded transform it into a single embedding vector. The diffusion model begins with random noise, and then iteratively the noises that are latent conditioned by the linguistic vector. And this process modifies and adjusts the visual vector in line with the semantic features of the linguistic vector. So the final result is a latent image which emerges from the dynamic integration of visual features and the linguistic extraction provided by the prompt into a single and different unit. Or in other words, the latent space is shaped by the text, meaning that linguistic features are implicitly embedded within the latent representation of the image. Therefore, the final decoded image renders visual features while also incorporating several linguistic elements that may not be directly visible, but introduce details or nuances that were not explicitly mentioned in the text, but were implicit in its semantic. Coming back to this image, the prompt's poetic resonance, for example, echo, silence, voices, calls for an environment that feels, hollow, muted, this kind of emotional environment. The misty forest, which is a place of natural echo chambers, plus the desaturated, almost monochrome color palette, seems to respond to that semantic tone. So we sense not only a forest, but the kind of forest in which echoes linger. But none of these elements was spelled out in the text. They emerge because the diffusion model has learned to associate echo with repetition and spatial depth, silence with concealment and subdued expression, etc., etc. So in other words, the final decoded image fuses over visual components, women in a veil, trees, fog, etc., with these subtle language-driven choices, details that were only implicit in the prompt semantic, but that provide to the scene with its emotional resonance and maybe, who knows, narrative depth. Therefore, generative processes as a transactive fusion give rise to a new type of semiotic entity that is inherently visual or linguistic at the same time, and that cannot be approached as other forms of semiotic fusion, semiotic composite, a form of syncretism. This is another type of semiotic entity whose problematization as such extend beyond the traditional discussions about its stochastic nature. And this is what I call the phenomenological divide, resulting from the difference between the ontogenesis of AI generative sign and how they appear in human experience. And in fact, this new sign echoed the problem Willem Flusser identified in his concept of technical image. The emergence of a visual sign that is at the same time a form of language. Indeed, the idea that AI generative processes engender a phenomenological divide, this disparity between the intrinsic nature of signs and their perceptual manifestation is already anticipated in Flusser's theory about technical image. According to Flusser, the technical image constitutes a new form of representation that is not merely an iconic representation in the traditional sense, because their images, or these images, are generated by code, writing instruction, and as such, they demand a different critical reading. And that's why Flusser insists that critics must learn to interpret technical images not just as visual artifacts, but as coded text requiring decryption. So for me, this divide is critical because our experience of latent spaces is only possible through these signs which serve as interfaces or mediators. Therefore, it becomes almost imperative to examine what the interpretive consequences of this phenomenological divide are, which tensions arise between the operational logic of latent spaces and what is directly involved to experience. For example, meanwhile, in the latent space, the distinction between words and images vanishes. In the interface level, what we are witnessing is a displacement of the image by language, because now the production of images is not a question of visual problems or visual issues, but linguistic one. When I want to produce an image, I am not thinking on visual problems. I am thinking about what kind of word or linguistic expression I have to use to produce a specific visual effect. So we can consider these images a form of language art instead of visual outcomes or visual objects. So I think it's imperative to explore what new analytical frameworks and tools are needed to bridge or navigate this gap, this divide. Here in this slide, we have some of them that we can use. And finally, this is the final slide. And this slide is the summary of the main ideas discussed during the presentation. And I think that it has been interesting for you. Thank you so much.
Nuria, thanks a lot for this insightful talk. It was really, I think really that you are a great semiotic. I'd like to ask you something or to comment one or two passages of your talk. The question of indexicality. I think that in semiotics, there is a Persian theorist, so probably I'm not sure that he agrees with me, but I would not say that there is no indexicality in these visualizations. Why? It's because we have to think, I think that we have to think indexicality not as something like in photographic art or really a trace of a part of the body or something else on a substrate, but in a more general way that concerns the fact that here the images we receive are linked to encyclopedia, are linked to annotations, are linked to regions of cultures. So I would not dare say that there is no indexicality, because indexicality makes the motivation of something, makes the fact that it's not pure hazard.
Yeah.
Randomness, yes. Yeah. So how to explain the non-randomness if you don't explain it through indexicality? I think that Peirce had an idea, very large idea of indexicality. Obviously, we speak of indexicality for photography, and but I'm convinced that when there is a chain of relations that cannot be the one they are, there is indexicality, but it has to be discussed. Because we also speak about indexicality for pictures, for digital images, and so on. So something else about what you said. You said, if I understood well, that the word operates an extraction to guide the process of visualization, and then you spoke about the fact that the model hesitates. For us, it's very important, this question of hesitation. Last year, we did something, we devoted the seminar to the theory of enunciation. And obviously, the theory of enunciation is that the basis, the idea that we have a lot of virtualities in language as well, and that we are canalized, I don't know, we are guided to choose a region or something like this. So this hesitation, what does this hesitation mean? I think that this hesitation can be explained through aleatoric, in the sense that every visualization depends on an aleatoric combination, or probably not. It's only a possibility. But I think that to understand the hesitation, we have to multiply the tests. So that is to use only the same prompt for more than 4 or 10 or 15 images to understand the range of this hesitation. Because the hesitation probably is not punctual, but it can be understood in an extension of outputs. I also wanted to tell you that with Enzo and Adrian, we did some experiments on when you spoke about regions and clusters. What we were looking for in our experimentations were not semantic clusters, but for clusters of style, how different regions of historical styles are migrating through a prompt speaking directly about historical style. We want to put our attention, and so it's only to say that we did this experience not to understand the clusters of meanings, but the clusters of compositional features, and there it's also important to work on the range of the region. The region is a multiplicity of small differentiations, so we tried to gather the most similar differentiations, differences through differentiations and not differences, to understand the regions of regions. I don't know if I was clear.
Yeah, but again, I think that we need a renewed terminology, because when I understand your position about intrinsicality, but for me, it is difficult to understand this process as intrinsicality is a statistical average. I mean, it's a statistical computation. So
yes, but this statistical average depends on something that has to be like this.
And this, but how do we term this phenomenon intrinsicality as well? This is my position. I think that we need a new terminology to properly understand and explain this new phenomena. Because if you use the terms that we traditionally use, we are bringing with us all the semantic features of the traditional semiotic studies. And I think that we need something. Maybe these words are not the most, the most proper words or whatever. But this is my position. This is my view. They need to understand what new phenomena we are facing and which kind of new terminology do we need to properly understand this new phenomena. And this about indexicality and about hesitate. Takes hesitate as a metaphor. I mean, this is not a hesitate. It's a statistical hesitate. I mean, do have clusters with almost equal probability, so you don't know what select. So okay, to average the different features, and then you get a balanced image with the different features coming from the different clusters. So this is this is my idea about hesitate, statistical hesitate. It's clarifying the notion.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Yves-Marie, no, aspettate. Allora, Yves-Marie, Gilles Aluminet, here.
Si on a le temps, mais sinon.
Ok. Yves-Marie.
Oui, sorry for my very bad English. Would you say that if you need, and if you reduce to probabilistic considerations, would you agree to say that any kind of verbal reaction could become part and parcel of new fusion and semiotic entities? That's my first question. And the second one, if anyway, apart from all these new technical possibilities, you conceive a pictorial motif as necessary, as made of linguistic verbal, not conceptual, verbal, and a mixture of verbal and visual contributions, but not from a probabilistic kind of association, always inside the rhetorical traditions. With disciplines, je ne sais pas comment on dit discipline en anglais, disciplines, it's what's part of, you have said, is kind of a rediscovery of the, perhaps a better definition of the pictorial motif, of the pictorial game like language games, always made of rhetorical lines sustaining a vision. Okay.
Yeah, agree.
Two questions.
Yeah, I agree with the first. I agree with the first question and with the second as well. Yes, this is one of the problems that we have to face: the rediscovery of things that we know or that we study from a different perspective or with a specific theoretical framework, and to rediscover with new perspective, are using these processes of AI generative technologies to rethink our theoretical frameworks, for example, about semiotics, but also about our history, for example, of media theory. So yes, I think that we are rediscovering many of the concepts theoretical framework that we have in our different disciplines. And this is a good material to do that, and an interesting material to do that. Yeah.
Gilles, à vous.
Two questions. To understand what is the difference between pansemiotic, multiple semiotic, and intersemiotic. The sequence of intersemiotic characterizes the process in the machinery producing image, with the criteria of coherence, isotopy, similarity, the way the image proceeds. But when you read the image, you come back to be multi-semiotic.
Right, very good point. Yeah.
So there is a dimension.
Yeah. It's it's a very good point. That's why I wanted to finish my presentation today with our human experience, because we are talking about this pansemiotic space, but this pansemiotic space is in the vector space, in the latent space, and we don't relate directly with the vector space. We relate with visual science and linguistic science. Yes, of course. So our experience is multisemiotic, but the thing is that we need to understand the ontological or the ontogenetical processes that is behind the vectorial spaces. That's why I say, or that's why I speak about this phenomenological divide, because we are seeing visual science and we are experiencing visual science and words and language, but the nature of this science is different. It's not a visual science or a language in the traditional sense.
So I will take an example of an artist from Malaga, which is called Picasso. I would say, as a painter, he was multi-semiotic. He knew the style of painting, different photography, different impressionists. He could work by his painting, with his interior, by sculpture, by graphist. So he was conscious of intersemioticity. But at the same time, he was conscious of multiple dimensions of semiosis. When he proposed a painting, he go to the limit of the spectator to propose a creation, a surprise. So he was probabilist in a way. So the operation could apply to intersemiotic, but also to multiple semiotic. And the gimmick of the internet event, to keep the balance and interpretation sequence.
Yeah, I know your point. Yeah, I know your point. But for example, in the case of Picasso, although you see a painting, and this painting could be intrinsically intersemiotic if we think in Picasso processes, creative processes. But this is an intersemioticity different from the statistical intersemioticity that we get from generative processes. Because in the Picasso's intersemioticity, we have different cultural layers that can be contradictory or can be have different frictions. Or I mean, the meaning emerges from the different frictions between different cultural layers. My cultural layers, the cultural layers coming from the author, the context, cultural layers. But in the case of generative processes, the final image is only a statistical algorithm. I mean, there is no cultural context, cultural layers conflicting among them or generating meaning from this contradiction, conflicts, paradox, etc., etc. It is a unified visual plane in images, in generative images. This is my. So there is an important. So I didn't say, but there is an important difference between this kind of generative intersemanticity that we see in generative images and the plural semantic that we observe and that we experiment in traditional images, where different cultural layers are conflicting or are putting into play. So the way of constructing and producing meaning is different. In some way, we could say that we move from a polyphony, heteroglossy, intertextuality in Kristeva terms, to a monophony. Everything is simplified in a visual plane. It is my view.
Yes, I understand you, but I think that the different regions, the different clusters of meaning are always in competition in conflict.
Yeah, of course.
So,
yeah, of course.
So obviously there is a sort of overlapping and
that's why
stratification.
That's why I say that we replace the dialectical tension, which is one of the main mechanisms of meaning production in traditional semiotic or traditional intersemiotic, with a probabilistic tension. For me, they are different phenomena, and the way of producing meaning is different. So that's why my insistence in we need a new terminology, we need a new category.
But the different clusters in conflict are motivated and indexed through a lot of cultural chains that.
But the competition between vectors is a statistical competition. It's not a cultural competition.
Yes,
it might be.
Sure, I'm wrong, but you are obviously you are right. But I think that we cannot reduce every output only to statistics. You know, so how statistics functions in relationship with these stratifications. We cannot say that the stratification is out of order. It's out, you know, because there is a stratification. You showed that there is a stratification. The different images you showed, the 4 images, 5, I don't remember. They have different, they are oriented through different clusters that mean echo of violent. So we cannot say that every image really does not call to a certain stratification of words and annotation.
No. That's right. That's why I say that this image can be also considered a kind of instantiation of a collective statistical memory, but a statistical memory, a cultural memory. This is different. Yes, of course. These images invoke a culturally constructed visual linguistic concept embedded in the model.
And yes, of course. I think that it's different. It's interesting to, for every image of every set of images, to go back to the cultural atmosphere and so on, because if we say that it's statistical, we
completely agree.
We close the discussion.
These images can serve as a material to explore how these different concept has been intermediately constructed, intermediately materialized throughout the time, over the time, because we have this in the model, it is codified and coded in that model. That's why I think that these images can serve as a new material to go in depth in how complex concept has been materialized and has been expressed, represented throughout the time. Yes, of course. Of course. I completely agree. Yeah.
Perfect. So we have to listen to Alumine and Leonardo.
Yes, my question, thank you very much. It was fascinating. My question was about collective statistical memory, a concept that I find very interesting. So I want to know a bit more about it. It's like a kind of new way of patrimony, human patrimony, because I think that it's like we should rethink the notion of patrimony, and I think that maybe we have the traditional visual culture and the new one that is statistical, and it's very interesting what you said, because maybe it's even more important to show the condition of production of this memory, because there are a lot of bias working there that could accentuate a lot of human problems, like racial, math, misogynist problems, all that. We were working a lot about that, what the machine represents. We need someone running strong or something like that. But at the same time, we see other cases very interesting that were presented, for example, by Cristina Botto here, when artists can create an archive that didn't exist, like the trans archive in Mexico. So it's like this collective statistical memory, I think that's very, very interesting as a concept, and the circulation, also the circulation. I put those images enter into museums, foundations, galleries, and in which status they do. So
thank you so much for the question, because this is one of my ideas, that latent spaces are now the new dispositive where we collect memory. In the past time, in the last time, we had archives, we had databases, and now we have latent spaces. So now we have a critical perspective on latent spaces in the same way that we have a critical perspective on archives and databases and something like that. Yes, this is my point. So, but your question is very interesting to see which kind of patrimony is this. I mean, cultural heritage, are we producing a new cultural heritage? A new cultural heritage from a cultural heritage? These different, layers that we are producing. Yes, for me, it's a very interesting point. And yes, this is my point as well. So now the latent space is our dispositive to preserve. Not only to preserve, but only to produce the new culture. So it's like a big functional sign, the functional system of science. We have a representation of a cultural object, but also this representation is the basis to produce a new cultural heritage or cultural object. So this is new complexity that we need to deal with.
Who is who are the main actors who legitimate.
Another important point. Yeah.
Yes, because before we have the artists with all the. And now
maybe the technological corporations that are producing the models.
Yeah,
maybe we could know. I mean, if you are an artist and are using this model and your production is very well, and I mean, so many you are legitimizing the model that you use to produce your artwork. So we know in a new culture of new value culture. So we need to rethink where value lies in this generative culture. Another important concept, generative culture. So
I put a remark. When you do factorial analysis, you make a collection of statistics, but you control the corpus. You could take the good corpus or have to change. When you go to generic memory and you need data from different processes are more or less controlled under the control of the GR. You don't control the corpus is flexible, so you can put requirement. It's a stereotype, but all this the flow of information.
That's why we need new tools. New tools, not only new frameworks, conceptual framework, but also new tools to.
Good correlation reference correspondent or more dynamic to flatten the distance. Corpus correct and vendor information. More or less the picture, but and you could put a part inside. Or you make an observation like the corpus is not correct. Go to the page.
Okay, Leonardo, last question.
No, I was going to try and be very short, but it's unfortunately it's a very big question. But I don't know if there's a small part of it or something. But I feel like I very much enjoy this perspective on this vectorial culture and all of the new conceptual categories that it opens up. And I hope that I won't repeat in a more banal way to many of the things that you've already said, because I've also been thinking about, the implications of this vectorialization. And in a way, my question is, it's a doubt in my own work, and I wonder whether I can somehow outsource the conceptual solution to you and make you do the clever work. But what happens when the linguistic aspect of multimodal LLM starts to dominate in effect over the other media types? I mean, for instance, one of the difficult technical things that happened with the question of racial stereotypes and gender stereotypes in DALL-E, right? This was DALL-E 2, and they simply injected some kind of extra keywords so that you would write a firefighter or a police person, I guess, or something like that, and it would add this kind of keyword thing. So easier to control, easier to correct the ideology on a linguistic level than on the text-image level, in clip, basically. Then the next generation said, okay, you can't even directly write the prompt. All you do is communicate actually with a language, with a chatbot, and then the chatbot itself communicates with the vectorial embedding space, LLM, et cetera, et cetera. So somehow, I don't know, I'm trying also to think about this question, but I have no good ideas. There's this tension where, yes, everything collapses out of mediality, but at the same time, it's also very linked, right? It's also extremely, and now I'm going to talk about some stuff with the retina and stuff like that. And there's this tension underlying, and I don't know what to do.
I completely agree. That's why for me it's very important to not to stay in the latent space, but in the human experience, because we don't relate with vectors or we relate in a space like with images, words, or whatever. And yet it's this tension between what happens in the latent space and what happens in the human experience that I have proposed this idea of an ontological divide or phenomenological divide, because there is a gap or a divide between these two levels or two levels, and I don't know exactly how to navigate or how to bridge this gap, but I think that it's a new domain of exploration and critical exploration, because it's this. So in the linear space, there is no, I mean, distinction between where images and doesn't. Everything is better. But in the interface level, we have this kind of tensions. Now, the image is not about image, it's about language, for example, or how to correct images with language, or vice versa. So now we have a new tension. Even we have a new dialectical tension. I didn't say, but we have a new dialectical tension that has to do with the probabilistic tension. Because you write a prompt and you get an image, and this is completely unexpected. So this is a tension as well between what you expect and what the model does. So this is a new kind of dialectical tension. It's not about a dialectical tension between two human subjects through a cultural object that is a mediator between the human subject, but I mean a dialectical tension between a human subject and the operational logic of generative models. So yeah, so we have, that's why I say we have a new completely a scenario, and we need a new terminology and concepts and categories of analysis to properly understand the new phenomena. And I would like not to reuse the old trends, because these old trends have a lot of semantic issues, semantic, ideological, theoretical. So I think that we need to reinvent our terminology. This is my idea.
For indexicality, probably depends. Like this. So, bravo.
Thank you so much.